God Emperor, me, back at it again with another video. This time, it's about what's in your pants. Maybe. Hello, and welcome back to H-Way Politics. So, did you hear? Apparently, gender just, doesn't exist. At least according to a Politics Amino local. Let's call them Anon 2 to differentiate them from my other recent video calling the local doomer guy racist, and I differentiate them because I don't think this guy is particularly deserving of being put on blast with their full username or anything. Of course, this is a belief which a lot of people hold, especially a lot of conservatives hold. I hold my sympathies towards conservatism. A truly shocking statement, I know. They can indeed correctly identify some things as harmful to the self that should not be engaged with, ethically speaking. Of course, their solutions are what get them, and they quickly fall into good grace. This belief is not one I hold sympathy towards, and it ought to be dissected and put out of its misery. For the purposes of this analysis, Anon 2 will be the representative, espousing their beliefs regarding the subject which I will review. To quote them specifically, gender doesn't exist in my opinion, you only have biological sex. And there's no science that indicates your claim in reference to gender existing. Why do they say this? Apparently, according to them, quote, empirical science doesn't deal in conceptual ideas. Right off the bat, this is a lot to take in. Any discussion on sex, gender, and any related conversations have to start at one place to get anywhere though. The dictionary. What is sex? Well, mainly it's the thing I had with your mom last night. But secondarily, the answer is extremely complicated. The dictionary provides some simple palliatives. From the Cambridge Dictionary, because Oxford is behind a paywall, we have the following few definitions that fit into our discussion. The physical state of being either male, female, or intersex, and all males considered as a group, or all females considered as a group. That is to say, sex is a biological and physical term which can refer both to a chromosomal and a physical group, and also to what group a given individual belongs to. Male is a sex and female is a sex, and a person's individual sex can be male or female or intersex. For a more rigorous definition, albeit not a perfect one, we can turn towards academia. In an article published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, they attempt to distill the history of the term sex, and gender, we'll get to that in a moment, to a definition that scientists can use going forward, as there was no real set consensus, like for most things, and as biological sciences have advanced, we have found the defining lines to be much blurrier than we imagined. They say, the noun sex includes the structural, functional, and behavioral characteristics of living things determined by sex chromosomes. Sex, noun, is derived from the Latin word sexus, meaning either the two divisions of organic nature distinguished as male or female, respectively. According to the Oxford Dictionary, sex, noun, has a definition as the sum of those differences in the structure and function of those reproductive organs on the ground of which beings are distinguished as male and female, and of the other physiological differences consequent on these. The class of phenomena with which these differences are concerned. Suck it, Oxford, I found your definition anyway. The article goes on to look at another initiative made around analyzing what sex means in the scientific literature. Quote, in the study of human subjects, the term sex should be used as a classification according to the reproductive organs and functions that derive from the chromosomal complement. Seems fairly definitive, pun intended. Nevertheless, the matter is further complicated. Another article from Nature in 2015 demonstrates how, even genetically, the line between male and female is difficult to draw. Like, imagine someone with Parkinson's in art school. Here's some interesting tidbits from the article. Her body was built of cells from two individuals, probably from twin embryos that had merged in her own mother's womb. And there was more. One set of cells carried two X chromosomes, the complement that typically makes a person female. The other had an X and a Y. Halfway through her fifth decade and pregnant with her third child, the woman learned for the first time that a large part of her body was chromosomally male. In 2009, researchers reported deactivating an ovarian gene called FOXL2 in adult female mice. They found that the granulosa cells that support the development of eggs transformed into Sertoli cells, which support sperm development. 2 years later, a separate team showed the opposite, that inactivating a gene called DMRT1 could turn adult testicular cells into ovarian ones. That was a big shock, the fact that it was going on postnatally, says Vincent Harley, a geneticist who studies gonad development at the MIMRPHI Institute for Medical Research in Melbourne. Studies of DSDs have shown that sex is no simple dichotomy, but things become even more complex when scientists zoom in to look at individual cells. The common assumption that every cell contains the same set of genes is untrue. Some people have mosaicism. They develop from a single fertilized egg but become a patchwork of cells with different genetic makeups. This can happen when sex chromosomes are doled out unevenly between dividing cells during early embryonic development. For example, an embryo that starts off as XY can lose a Y chromosome from a subset of its cells. If most cells end up as XY, the result is a physically typical male, but if most cells are X, the result is a female with a condition called Turner syndrome, which tends to result in restricted height and underdeveloped ovaries. A few cases have been documented in which a mosaic XXY embryo becomes a mix of two cell types, some with two X chromosomes and some with two X's and a Y, and then split early in development. Microchimeric cells have been found in many tissues. In 2012, for example, immunologist Lee Nelson and her team at the University of Washington in Seattle found XY cells in post-mortem samples of women's brains. The oldest woman carrying male DNA was 94 years old. Other studies have shown that these immigrant cells are not idle. They integrate into the new environment and acquire specialized functions, including, in mice at least, forming neurons in the brain. And in the closing paragraph, they ask a very poignant question. So if the law requires that a person is male or female, should that sex be assigned by anatomy, hormones, cells, or chromosomes? And what should be done if they clash? Seriously though, this article is deeply fascinating. If you have the time to check it out and you're done listening to what I have here, you should absolutely go check this out too. That's definitely worth it. Also, the article link has 828 in it, so it's automatically something I have to shill for. So sex is a spectrum, specifically a bimodal spectrum, but a spectrum nonetheless. We can define it off of our chromosomal composition and the features they're associated, but it is simply insufficient. It is possible we will never have a perfect definition, as is the case for so many things in our world. We are continually discovering that nature doesn't care about division, their distinction, or definition. Things just are. Then we have to ask, what is gender? Well, mainly, gender is the thing I had with your dad last night. But secondarily, the answer is extremely complicated. Let's run through this process again. From the Cambridge Dictionary, gender is a group of people in a society who share particular qualities or ways of behaving which that society associates with being male, female, or another identity. They also have the definition of used to refer to the condition of being physically male, female, or intersex, equals having a body that has both male and female characteristics. But, as the dictionary itself points out, they are explaining how the word is used, not necessarily what it means generally. And as we will see shortly, this position is borne out in the literature. The Journal of Applied Physiology from earlier provides further insight into gender. Quote, gender can be thought of as the behavioral, cultural, or psychological traits typically associated with one sex. Gender, noun, is derived from the Latin word genus, referring to kind or race. Gender, noun, is defined as a kind, sort, or class referring to the common sort of people. And in the study of human subjects, the term gender should be used to refer to a person's self-representation as male or female, or how that person is responded to by social institutions on the basis of the individual's gender presentation. Gender, then, refers specifically to personal, cultural, and societal beliefs, expectations, and reactions to sex or perceived sex. I am fond of this analogy. Gender is to sex what engineering is to science. Engineering, it can be simply understood, is science applied to our world. Gender, it can be simply understood, is sex applied to our society. There are social categories of gender which embody roles, traditions, expectations, and values, and a given individual can belong to one group or another. For an example, the physical prevalence of testosterone in men compared to women is a biological facet and belongs to the category of sex. However, our perception of men as domineering and physically powerful, as opposed to the meek and physically weak women, is gender. It is a biological facet looked at through the lens or applied to society. Gender is, necessarily, a social construct. But it is real. Those beliefs exist. Those expectations exist. Those values exist. The classification of gender is an extant classification. Gender is not biological, it is social, this is true. But it nevertheless refers to categorization which does exist. To deny that gender is real is to deny that people and groups of people have ever, or indeed could ever, have beliefs regarding biological sex. Anantu is very simply wrong here. They themselves have their own perspective on the sexes, and therefore necessarily engage with gender, even if they deny its existence. Now, I want to engage with this further, however. Anand's two position is not merely a definitional misconception, It is based on faulty rationale that leads to yet more faulty beliefs. Recall the other two quotes of Anantu's that I mentioned in the beginning. There's no science that indicates your claims, and empirical science doesn't deal in conceptual ideas. The latter statement is used to support the former. They say it outright. If it isn't empirical, it isn't science. If it isn't empirical, it doesn't exist. This is further emphasized when looking at other direct quotes. How can it be proven when it's like a malleable idea? Well, what the difference material between a transgender person who aims to transition from male to female and a man who tries to appear feminine but is actually just a normal male in terms of how they feel about themselves? Beyond a sense of personal identity, basically nothing. So my question would then be, and I ask this earnestly because I'm genuinely curious, why should we accept that there really is a difference? The difference is in terms of how they identify, but there's no real material difference, right? I mean, they're exactly the same. Why should we treat them differently? But those are ideas and concepts. Can two people who are exactly the same be fundamentally different because of abstract ideas? Because of abstract ideas that rely totally on one's personal identity and no empirical basis? That empirical data was about a man who lived in a feminine way. There's no way to establish empirically that individual is different from an individual who is biologically male but presents in a feminine way. And biological men who present in a feminine way shouldn't be defined as female. And there's no difference empirically. This notion that something must be empirical to be science, much less be empirical to be real, is fundamentally flawed. Now, they claim to not be a pure empiricist. According to them, they don't believe something must be empirical to be real, yet their own arguments point towards the exact opposite. Regardless of what they truly believe regarding empiricism, they apply a purely empirical lens to this topic or are incredibly incompetent in communicating otherwise. Science deals in conceptual ideas, to start. Observation and experiments are incredibly useful for science, obviously, and compose the majority of data gathering from the hard sciences. And yes, I understand the very dichotomy between hard and soft science is dubious at best and actively anti-science at worst, but just deal with it, it's a useful colloquialism. But let me point your eyes to something a little interesting. Theoretical physics. Woo! I love shifting from the definition of gender to goddamn theoretical physics. Politics is a truly horrible, horrible thing. Theoretical physics is a branch of physics which is probably the archetype of a hard science, maybe besides geology, pun intended and scripted, yet deals in, get this, abstractions. Specifically, theoretical physics is a branch of physics that employs mathematical models and abstractions of physical objects and systems to rationalize, explain, and predict natural phenomena. This is in contrast to experimental physics, which uses experimental tools to probe these phenomena. Theoretical physics necessarily deals in the conceptual, in the unproven, in the unempirical. There is no observation we can make with our current technology and understanding, and no experiment we can run to look directly at the Big Bang and examine how it evolved. And yet, thanks to theoretical physics, we can know with high degrees of confidence what went on, and because of theoretical physics, it is slowly transitioning into experimental physics. This exists. Duh. Or for something more conceptual, we can look at the multiverse. There is absolutely nothing we can currently do to look at a broader multiverse. Yet countless hours of modeling, solving equations that probably take up more space than this entire document, and conceptualizing within various frameworks has been dedicated to figuring out certain bounds of the multiverse, should one exist under a given interpretation. This is science, and this is highly conceptual science, and it is the coolest thing ever. Next, I'll direct your attention to the so-called soft science. This generally belongs to the social sciences, psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, etc. Of course, these sciences are absolutely empirical and utilize a lot of rigorous experimentation and observations. But the conception is that they use less of it than the hard science, and that's probably generally true. But again, they are real. Even if we can't directly observe something like depression, psychology and psychiatry tell us it is real, because they utilize methods of scientific exploration aside from direct observation. Point being, something doesn't have to be empirical to be science, or real. Anantu is wrong. Simple as. From a false premise that empirical science is the absolute standard, that anything else which doesn't fit into it is comparatively worthless, Anantu built to the false belief that gender isn't real. From the false belief that gender isn't real, Anantu constructed false arguments relating to gender, gender expression, and gender identity. The latter two terms are easy to understand once you get gender. Gender expression is how you present yourself in regards to gender, i.e. in regards to the cultural values and expectations. And gender identity is what group you personally identify as belonging to, how you view yourself, your own personal identity. There are many good questions to be asked and debates to be had around these two concepts, and to the extent which we should respect them and use them as societal benchmarks. There is also the opposite of that. Sounds like a really feminine guy when you think about it, who's psychologically associated with femininity but is no less biologically a man than me. No one Anantu was discussing with at the time were claiming gender and sex were biologically the same. That claim was entirely theirs. The problem, then, is that they fundamentally misrepresent the discussion. I completely agree, actually, that you can't change your biological sex, at least not until extensive gene editing postnatally becomes a thing. Your gender, gender expression, or gender identity do not necessarily correlate with your sex, and absolutely don't change your sex. But Anantu is saying this in the context of those three terms. No one is saying someone ceases to be a biological man on the basis of being feminine. There are guys that are masculine, there are guys that are feminine, there are ladies that are feminine, and there are ladies that are masculine. Then there's a small number of people with intersex conditions. That's it, basically, in a nutshell. Is there anyone my categorization doesn't cover? Well, to be petty, yes, Anantu failed to cover the androgynous. But to the actual point, they again assert that gender is completely false, and that leads them to misrepresent everyone else's arguments. Not really, I mean, I don't deny masculine traits, I just deny that a lack thereof makes someone less of a man. I expressed disapproval with this position. This is what I said in response to it. Again, gender is kind of just a thing that is. Its existence is not debated. It is a specific term which refers specifically to societal and cultural expectations and beliefs regarding sex and sexual characteristics. To deny that gender exists is to attempt to completely deny that such beliefs and expectations exist, which is frankly idiotic. Fortunately, Anantu responded to this statement with, "I don't deny masculine and feminine traits if that's what you mean." No, this is not what I meant. Look at these specific words: societal and cultural expectations and beliefs. I believe it very evident that I did not refer to masculine and feminine traits. And biological men who present in a feminine way shouldn't be defined as female. Depends. How are you defining female? Is it a biological definition, or is it gender? Because presentation is intrinsically tied to gender, and if it's biological, what happens when the individual is intersex? Especially in the far more complicated ways laid out earlier in the Nature article. It's not. You're talking about Native American guys that present and live in a feminine way. I still consider them fellas. You can say they are biologically male, sure, but the culture around them understood them as being of the female gender, completely regardless of sex. Can't really fight that. That's how the culture operated. Whether you're from a native tribe or are Chinese or European, if you're biologically male, then you can present as a woman, but materially and empirically, there's no difference between you and a biological male who identifies as male and is female presenting, which is the crux of my point. There's no difference empirically. Empirical is not the end-all be-all of scientific inquiry. There is a difference, and it's a difference of internal experience. Someone with depression who is very good at hiding it outwardly and someone without depression have, from outside appearances, the same state of being, obviously assuming all is the same. There is no observation we can make, but there is an undeniably different lived experience between the two. Similarly, there is an undeniably different lived experience between one person who identifies as a given gender and another person who does not, even if they both end up presenting the same. That's the actual point being made, that there's a difference even if we cannot outwardly directly observe a difference. Just because we cannot directly observe something does not mean that difference does not or cannot exist. Well, if that was true, then you would agree that a male that presents like a female and has traditionally feminine traits, what is considered traditionally feminine traits, is no less of a man than me in terms of his biology. The opening of, "if that was true, then you," is in reference to something another individual said during this debate. The other person said, "The entire point is that there isn't and shouldn't be one way of life for men or for women, and that gender stereotypes or societal roles shouldn't be slapped onto a child that was only just born based on what their body looks like, lol." So Anantu here is suggesting that this text means what he said about a biological man being a biological man. Now, I don't want to speak for this other individual, but I do believe they also think your biology doesn't change based on gender or related terms. So they would be in agreement about that. But Anantu is still misrepresenting the point. The point is that things exist beyond just biology. Hopefully that's been hammered in enough by now. I don't have much to say as far as a conclusion is concerned. Anantu, you aren't yet needing a soliloquy and a plea. Just make sure that doesn't change. But I do want you to be aware of the false premises you had taken up, and now can discard. Gender exists. It's just a thing that is. It may not exist in the same way as something like a rock we can pick up off the ground, but it is real in the same way that ideologies are real and exist, because they represent a collection of beliefs and narratives and perspectives. To deny the ideology, you need to deny the existence of those beliefs. To deny gender, you need to deny the existence of beliefs regarding sex. But someone else has brought up something else interesting, another potential reason to deny the existence of gender. To give a spoiler alert, I don't believe that this is a valid way to discard an entire sociological classification of a term, but I will address it far more specifically and far more trenchantly in a part 2? Yep, this has been 828 Politics, but I will be back with a part 2, of course. And if you want to be here for that part 2, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I get a hit of dopamine every time I see the numbers go up, and that always does actually genuinely help and gives me a reason to actually make these. So yeah, never stop learning.